That's how powerful my class is. Welcome to All Good Points, your weekly cannabis news roundup presented by Vopfas and Hanway Associates. I am Paul North.
And I'm George McBride.
So we did record this last week, George, and we got what I would describe as some top quality content, but unfortunately the audio was a bit off.
Well, it wouldn't be 2020 without some technical difficulties, would it?
It was definitely a 2020 start to do the video.
Yeah, it's quite sad because I actually thought it was quite good, but
well, maybe one day that footage will re-emerge.
Maybe.
We'll do some magic with the audio. But there were some things that were really important that we talked about that we wanted to revisit and bring back up. The first is everything that went on in the States, with 5 states opening up new markets. So Montana, New Jersey and Arizona all legalised for recreational use. South Dakota and Mississippi launched medical cannabis markets, and then Oregon just went all out, decriminalised all drugs for possession and legalised psilocybin therapy, and then DC decriminalised psychedelic plants. So there's a whole range of drug reform, but 5 states legalising was a pretty big moment in the cannabis reform movement.
Yeah, for sure. And new historic highs for the support for federal legalisation. There was a Gallup poll, and I think it's up at 68-69% now, which is phenomenal because there's very few issues on which that many people agree, really. And we've got a couple of states pushing through the legislature changes to legalise, most notably New York, who are now insisting they will be legalising rec in 2021.
Do you think this is kind of such a... Is this the clear signal that reform is needed in the states, that like it is now a matter of time before every state has some kind of legal program? Or is it your prediction that you will see kind of like a federal intervention to legalise it across the board, or is this going to be more states going to go?
The story's a long way from over, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've got to deal with the fact that Biden isn't actually that supportive. I know he's only an individual. He's got people in his team who are very supportive. So banking reforms, very, very likely, Safe Banking Act, but actual federal legalisation still potentially a way off. But still completely plausible under this term, not outside the realms of possibility. But it looks like it's still going to be state by state for a few years at least.
I mean, the banking reform is what's needed, isn't it, really? That's the kind of like, that, from speaking to companies over there, like that is such a... It makes it so difficult for them to grow as a business.
And it would be very good over here, obviously, in London, financial services sector, if the banking becomes easier and UK banks can get involved and professional service providers in the UK can start getting involved in legal markets in the US. I think that would be brilliant for the UK and something that hopefully is a catalyst for reform across the pond.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a whole proceeds of crime thing, but we won't go there because that in itself is a bit of a nightmare. But that, I guess, that is still a little bit of a barrier at the moment, isn't it, in terms of the...
Yeah, although there's an interesting development in Gibraltar where they're pushing through a change to the Proceeds of Crime Act specifically to facilitate legal investment into cannabis businesses. I think that's great, and nimble little jurisdictions will continue to do that, and people will find ways to invest in these, exciting opportunities in the US.
The other thing, I guess it was the last couple of weeks been like good news, bad news. So what was going on in the States was really good news, positive, exciting. But then the New Zealand referendum didn't quite go the way, we pro-reformers would want it to go. And 50.7% of the vote went no. So it was close. Brexit vibes. It was a classic kind of, just about down the middle. But the polling for that was looking really good.
Yeah. So there's, the No campaign has done very well, and the Yes campaign has done obviously less so, hasn't it? Because
it's not looking great.
it looked good for yes at the beginning of the campaign, and no's won it, and there are lots of people, you know, throwing around allegations that, you know, of impropriety by the no campaign, deliberately misleading people. But, you know, as we're all aware, political campaigning in this day and age is a dirty business, and people get their hands dirty doing political campaigning. And I think there needs to be some acceptance that maybe more could have been done on the yes side of things.
I think so. And I guess that's like an interesting and useful discussion as to like how do you engage the public on, you know, on the debate of cannabis and kind of what do you do. And I think one thing we learned quite a lot at Volkfast was kind of how you essentially like engage that crowd that don't agree with you, and what sort of initiatives can you put into place to bring people on a journey. And I think one interesting reflection I had was it's really important, I think, to not kind of fall into the trap of just kind of shouting back with the no campaign.
If no comes out and puts out a big billboard with some sensational claim, you know, that says that there's going to be all this advertising to children, even though the regulations don't allow that, you shouldn't necessarily get caught into talking about their billboard campaign, because that's just allowing them to control the narrative and not really the productive way of going about it. And I think clear, simple, you know, campaigning that focuses on your own core message more than it does on the other sides is probably a better way to go. But I don't want to be, you know, people fought long and hard on the yes side, and there was a lot of hard work that went into it, and it was bloody close. So
we don't want to discredit the kind of activism and the work that's gone on. Like it's all been really good stuff, and I think that it is, you know, it's difficult, and it's difficult.
It's unfortunate because when I went to New Zealand when I was 19, so a bloody long time ago now, you know, cannabis was ubiquitous, people smoking it outside pubs, in public areas, in a way that wasn't being done in London at the time. And it seemed very much like cannabis liberalisation was on the cards, you know, 15 years ago. And now there was the opportunity. It's a very liberal society. They voted overwhelmingly for the right to die and other really liberal progressive reforms. And yet somehow cannabis didn't get through. And I think there are some issues there around fears around the industry that haven't been properly addressed. And I think it's really unfortunate because I think there was a great opportunity for Kiwis to build their own businesses, huge amount of job creation, you know, huge amount less, you know, unnecessary criminal justice interferences into people's lives. There was a real opportunity for a real net social gain. And I think there's been a real fear around the industry that's prevented that. And so the industry needs to speak louder to defend itself. And, you know, people need to start trusting in the idea that this does bring positive change. Which
definitely. And I think that, like, I guess that's what I was writing about the other week when I wrote that editorial for Volkfast. Like, in my eyes, and I think there was tension here in New Zealand. I think there was no doubt, like, a little bit of tension between advocacy and the industry. But really, like, I see the role as advocacy is to kind of positively engage the industry and you know, maybe, make sure part of the debate is around how can that industry be good for the people of the country. And, you know, you don't want to, you know, programmes which kind of give back to communities which have been disproportionately impacted by the illicit nature of the drug is obviously a really important discussion to have. And we need to, I think the industry should always try and do more in that area. But sometimes I think the fear of the industry has kind of held some of those discussions and debates back a little bit. And the no campaign certainly in the States, I think was mirrored somewhat in New Zealand, kind of plays into that fear a little bit. That's one thing they pick up. If you look at the proponents of reform in the States, you know, they play the kind of big lobbying tobacco card, don't they? You should be scared of the industry. They're going, you know, and it's this kind of like, well, big industry is just as bad as criminal gangs. And I think as advocacy groups need to engage a bit more sensibly in that discussion.
Not fall into that trap. How bad you might think somebody like a Nestle or a Diageo or a British American Tobacco or some massive multinational is, they don't traffic people, they don't murder people they have disputes with. You know, and there's a significant improvement in the way business is done when it's done within a legal market by companies operating within the law. And it's mad that you have to actually explain that to people. I think, you know, but people forget, I think, how bad organised crime can be. You know, it's
horrendous.
Yeah,
absolutely horrendous. Yeah. So there's definitely lessons to be learned there, and like, you know, I guess in some ways it was close, which isn't a bad thing. Like, I'm sure it's not a debate that's going to disappear in New Zealand. It's not like they'll never talk about cannabis anymore. I think it gives them something. They've missed an opportunity. They've missed an opportunity to be a global leader. But it's not a debate that's going to disappear. I'm sure it's something that they'll keep building on. I think to try and make that point more eloquently that I fell over earlier, I guess when I came to Volkfast, one of the things I learned is that need when you're engaging on like mass public campaigning is to like actually listen to people's fears. And there is, I guess the point I was trying to make is there is a temptation to kind of just disagree and try and prove someone wrong when you debate on a subject. So you could say like, I guess typical thing we've heard is cannabis is dangerous, it causes mental health problems, if you legalise it you get more problems. But I think what I've learned on campaigning is that instead of just saying, well, actually, instead of fighting back, you're absolutely wrong, it's actually not that dangerous, alcohol is way more dangerous, you just need to educate yourself, you know, look at the evidence, blah, 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 blah. Instead, just going, okay, cool, well, you've got some fears, let's talk about your fears. You're not wrong to have those fears. Cannabis does cause problems. People do get addicted. There are some concerns around how that can impact on people's mental health. But let's have a discussion about how a legal market might help with that. And it feels like, I guess you take someone on more of a journey, and then the proposed model looks like more of a solution, rather than the initial stance just being, well, actually, you need to just educate yourself. Because that just switches people off. People then are like, oh, whatever.
It's totally the wrong angle to go in. And I think when we were speaking about this last week on the Forgotten podcast, the Lost Tapes, I mentioned the fact that, you know, often when people are talking to me about risk to youth, which is one of the main concerns with legalising cannabis, I say, well, look, I totally understand that, because when I was a teenager, I had a problem with my cannabis use. Like, that stemmed from other problems in my life. I don't think the cannabis was the like root cause, and I think that's one of the things we need to talk about. But being aware that I was smoking cannabis all day when I was in school, I was at a good school, so I still managed to do well. But for a lot of people, that could destroy their education, getting into a pattern of using cannabis all day when they're 14, 15, 16. And I had teachers who were aware of it, and they would allude to it but never mention it, because there was a zero tolerance policy and they know they would have had to expel me. So then you don't get engaged, you don't get the treatment that you need, all of that sort of stuff. Whereas if they'd known that I was drinking, that would have been a far easier conversation for them to have. My parents would have been brought in, there would have been discussion about treatment services, the whole attitude would have been totally different. So it's about that kind of, you know, the setting that legalised market creates to actually deal with the problems that do exist with young people and cannabis, because they are real, and it's recognising that they're real and saying that this is here to help fix them, not to say, oh, don't worry about it, it's totally safe, it's never killed anyone. Well, it's not killed anyone, but there's a lot of people that it hasn't really helped.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the things I find the most frustrating around our current setup with regard, not just cannabis, but just young people and substances, is we don't view kids who use substances as vulnerable, and we don't help them. Instead, we stigmatise them and push them out of the education system and point a finger at them, particularly if they're demonstrating other behaviours alongside that. It can be a bit of an easy way for a school to be like, you're a nightmare, go to a pupil referral unit. And I find that that's why we campaigned on that previously. I think, legal markets certainly present an opportunity to have a different conversation, because you're right, you know, a kid drinking would be treated in that way, but like there's such an important conversation to have around the vulnerability of kids who are taking substances, and it's such an opportunity to have a conversation, go, what's going on? You all right? Like where are you at? What's going on? Rather than what are you doing with that? Do you know what I mean? Get out of school.
Yeah, and there are nice people in the system at Prus and elsewhere helping, but the system is not helping. And despite their best efforts, and I've done teaching at Prus, and lots of kids who've got kicked out for various reasons, including drugs, and then end up dealing, because a lot of people come and recruit from Prus for all sorts of stuff, including county lines, and then kids end up dealing, and then they're dealt with by the criminal justice system from the age of 11 as adults. And so then they've gone from being a vulnerable kid who needs some help at school to being expelled to then being exposed to stuff that most adults don't have to get exposed to in their whole lives, and then being treated as adults by the criminal justice system. That's a massive issue. So I think,
Huge.
yeah.
And it's so we're going off.
We've gone way off script.
We're going off script, but I don't know. I think it's something that we both care about quite deeply. Because the last point to make on that is that the other thing that does for the kid or the young person is to then think, well, you guys don't understand. So like when they are getting exploited and they're in this nightmare situation, they're going to talk to anyone. Because like you didn't get it then, you won't get it now. Because we didn't show that intent to be like, are you all right? What's going on?
Yeah.
Anyway, I guess we've gone from campaigning into kind of a wider point around legalisation and the benefits it brings. But I guess that for me drives home why New Zealand was a missed opportunity, because that'll still be going on in New Zealand. You know what I mean? With that being an illicit drug, that stigma remains for it.
But it's those kind of conversations, I think, that actually, and stories that actually do help, because a lot of people just say, oh no, look at Canada and use rates have gone down among young people since it legalised. And that's great to have that information point. But like statistics aren't very persuasive, you know?
Statistics are terrible. Evidence is terrible.
Yeah.
Evidence is not something you should always campaign on. It is the stories and the narrative, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%.
Anyway, in more recent news this week, other things that have gone on, there's the study that came out from Matt, the 40, Tom Freeman and others that looked at changes in THC and CBD concentrations between 1970 and 2017, and it found that THC levels have risen by an average of 0.29% each year. This isn't like new news, is it? Because we've known for a while that THC is going up in cannabis.
Although there was another study that came out, and I can't remember who did it, but recently showing that Dutch coffee shops have actually the potency on average of the cannabis has decreased from last year. So people have got better and better at growing cannabis over the last 30 years, you know, and if you measure better in quite narrow metrics of how much of the actual active component are you producing, then you end up producing more and more and more. But at some point, people want actual quality, and I think there's a lot said about the potency of cannabis, and it definitely has got stronger, but it's not just a simple bad thing that's happened, in my view. There's
a bit more complex. Potency, as you know, with me, is a likely subject to talk about. It's something that I've riled a lot of people up in the past. I try and avoid the potency chat these days, but I think it's one thing that we get thrown back at us quite a lot is this, where, you know, look at the North American market, people want really strong weeds, you know, like people like weed with lots of THC, and I think I've had some interesting chats with a wide number of people, characters like Chris Snowden at the IEA, kind of talks about different markets and consumer preferences and consumer choice, and, you know, I get that in North America it is a preference and there's a lot of it, but I can't help but thinking once you provide a choice and some options, you know, people may well pick a different route, and maybe that's what you're alluding to slightly with the Dutch study that was showing that actually doesn't, because surely some of that is consumer choice, and people say, no, well actually I prefer that strain, I'll try that strain. So I would imagine the coffee shops kind of meet consumer demand, you know, they just randomly get weed in, not like, well, you know, they'll
they're responding to what's selling, of course they are.
So I guess it's information we already know. I mean, it's interesting nonetheless, and for me it strengthens the need for reform. It's kind of a, you know, we should have control, shouldn't we? I think you know, it's a sign of an illicit market when strength goes up, right? You see that in most illicit drug markets, so it's a sign of need control. Other this good news, Israel, the health ministry is backing recreational use of cannabis, and they've put out a roadmap to legalisation, which expects to see quite major reform next year. There's some stats on how big that is. It's estimated their illicit market is worth over $6 billion NIS a year, which is $1.7 billion, and they earn them something like 11 to 19 billion NIS in tax revenue in the first 5 years of legalisation. They're kind of quite a front runner, Israel, aren't they, when it comes to weed? They've been on it for quite a while, innovating a lot when it comes to medical.
Well, they're great, you know, horticultural, agricultural innovators as well, and also, you know, a bastion for certain liberal freedoms in their neck of the woods.
Yeah.
So it's not that surprising. And there's some really good stuff going on in Israel, and it's really promising. I'm excited to see them move on.
They're really good. There's a lot of really interesting innovations coming out, isn't there, in terms of application of the drug in Israel. They seem to be kind of leading the way with quite a lot of the sort of science behind it they've been doing. So that conference we went to a few years ago, what was it called?
Cannabis.
Cannabis, yeah, that was it.
Yeah, that was good. There was a load of interesting people there. I think it's fantastic news, and it's being done not just driven by the courts. You know, this is driven by popular demand and from the establishment, and I think that's really important because we've got this real reluctant dragging reform in Mexico, and that's not ideal. Whereas in Israel, to see the medical market thriving, imports for cannabis thriving, people consuming cannabis without fear of prejudice and stigma, and then that opening up into a new market which is going to create jobs and tax revenue and help a lot of people. So it's good news.
Good thing, yeah, good news all around, all good points. Mexico, they're voting today, maybe they're voting right now on legalising cannabis for recreational use.
Yeah, it's just been delay though, hasn't it? So we will see. And they don't look. I'm still a bit uncertain about how it's going to pan out in Mexico.
Italy, interesting. Organised crime gangs losing out due to the budding smokable hemp industry. A 33% reduction in the number of cannabis plants illegally cultivated has been reported, and that's due to this cannabis light, a smokable hemp-like cannabis light they've got out, and its entry into the Italian market came from a loophole in the 2016 legalisation. The vague language around THC content means that they can have 0.6% THC in the cannabis.
And then they were selling it as not for human consumption, kind of much in the same way as like the spice thing in the UK that I wrote that report about at VaultFacts. It's a shame though because it's been people pushing loopholes, and then there have been a lot of resistance from the authorities trying to clamp down on the market. So it's not the kind of ideal route to reform, but it's quite interesting.
What I find interesting about that, what I like about that, is I think that's the sort of cannabis that people should be more enlightened about, just like low levels of THC. I think one thing we talked a lot about over what some of the projects we're doing next year is the need to educate people better on the variety of the plant and the breadth of the plant, the breadth of experiences that you can have. Whereas I think a lot of people think of it as like, oh, you smoke weed, you get really high, you're smoking a joint. Whereas it just doesn't have to be the case. Like, there's such a range of experiences.
Yeah, I think there'll always be a monumentally larger market for the stuff that gets you off your face, obviously. But but I think there is a substantial market for that light stuff, which isn't really met by the black market in the UK in particular, because there's less interest in selling that stuff. There's more interest in selling the stuff to people who are heavy consumers who are going to buy more. And so there's not real interest in providing all these other stuff that people could get some benefit from and some enjoyment from, and could be really popular, I think.
Yeah, and it's 33% is a lot. Like, that's taking a big dent in the market.
Although, how do they know that? Is that from seizure data or what? Because obviously they haven't gone around counting all the illegal plants. They've got everyone to come and announce how many illegal plants they've got.
Is that the mafia? Yeah, we were just waiting to come around and count your plants. Is that right? Renowned for their engagement with the scientific community in the mafia, aren't they? So yeah, I'm not sure. I know it's from a study that they did. One more bit, and let's talk about the ecosystems. Argentina, it's a lot of South American stuff. Argentina, well, they legalised for medical in 2016, didn't they? So it's already been legal there, although fairly restrictive in terms of what you can get it for and the conditions. But this week they brought some new regulations out which have established what you could basically allow in self-cultivation. Although they've not given a clear, I don't think they've told people how much you can grow yet, but they're basically saying we're going to permit home cultivation. And I think there's like quite a mounting pressure there for them to go further.
Yeah,
there's quite a lot of political support for them to go the next step. Do you know what I mean? And sort of embrace adult use recreational. But again, positive, good news, good sign.
Reform
in America is good.
Yeah, and I think it's all very different regionally, isn't it? Like we've seen that slight, lack of momentum in New Zealand not reforming, but that's not impacting the fact that Mexico is still legalising, Argentina are still reforming, Israel is still reforming, and that's going to continue regardless of the fact that there are going to be setbacks and delays along the way around the world. The general momentum still seems pretty strong.
Pretty big, pretty strong. And then let's finish on, again, something else we talked about last week, which I think is an important discussion. That was the ecosystem that you guys put out through the first Wednesdays network, which mapped out all the key players, all the stakeholders across Europe. What we talked about last time, I kind of asked, thinking about when, if you reflect, I guess it'd be 2.5 years ago now, like Europe's come a hell of a long way in terms of what exists and what's out there. So was it, how does that feel for someone who's kind of seen that ecosystem grow? Like, you're quite encouraged by the developments? Do you think there's more to come? Like, what's your
really encouraged. Even if you just go back to 2015, when the team at Hamway started looking, working in the cannabis sector and working in reform, Europe was pretty much just ECAN and GW. And then there were some interesting other notable people like ICCI in Prague and others. But, it wasn't a very diverse crowd of interesting companies. And now you look and you see that the significant regulatory barriers to operating cannabis businesses in Europe have led people to do some really interesting stuff. There's really interesting tech companies. There's really interesting formulation and manufacturing companies. There's all sorts of interesting stuff going on. And it's not just grow cannabis and sell it. It's figuring out how you engage with doctors, figuring out how you monitor the impact of cannabis on patients and their use, figuring out how you deliver it in a safer, more effective way. And that work is being done around Europe, and there's been money flowing into the industry, there's been talent flowing into the industry, and they're going to continue to build what's looking to be quite a reputable, credible industry in Europe that can survive even in the face of really significant challenges from regulators.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, I guess that's something that's just going to keep growing, keep expanding as more innovations take place, more reforms happen across Europe. Like, we launched the ECAN network, European Cannabis Advocacy Network, I guess it was about 8 days ago now, 10 days ago. And that's been amazing, like speaking to advocates all across Europe, because I think certainly at VaultFast, we're very focused on the UK, we're kind of our head absorbed in UK reform. And it's been great kind of zooming out and speaking to the people across Europe. And it's really encouraging what's going on. Like, we were having some really good conversations with a German advocacy organisation. They're really hopeful, growing support there. It was great kind of connecting with these groups and just finding out all that wide reform that's taking place. It does seem to pick up speed. The Dutch experiment's interesting. That's another quite exciting aspect.
Yeah, we're going to find out who's won these 10 licenses in January, which is going to be interesting. The first, fully legal recreational cannabis businesses in Europe. So that's the beginning of something quite exciting.
Exciting times. Mm-hmm. Cool. I think that sums it up, George. I think we've wrapped up the main points from last week, thrown in some stuff for this week. And
there's a lot going on around the world, isn't there?
Sit
here talking about it all day. So many good points.
All good points. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you next time.